This was a man who was really the godfather of heroin in Ireland.
The tsunami of heroin suddenly hit Dublin. It went from bad to disastrous overnight.
Some of the kids were robbing their mothers, their fathers. There were syringes on balconies.
This was a life and death issue for an awful lot of people.
The guards were never going to give up. Young people were dying, communities were devastated. He was a mercenary. Nobody had been employed in an undercover capacity working in drugs. It was a dangerous, challenging environment. All roads led to Larry Dunn.
Inner city Dublin in 1980, a tight-knit community suddenly torn apart by a brand new epidemic.
Today, our government recognises that we may have as many as 4,500 heroin users in Dublin City.
You'd inject yourselves on stairways, anywhere, gardens.
There's chaos beginning to happen on the street. Some of the kids were robbing their mothers, their fathers.
It's a living hell. You hang out in squats, you'd eat out of dustbins. You would literally do anything for drugs.
The individual addicts felt isolated, hopeless, and were prepared to die knowing they had no other route.
The one man who started this heroin epidemic was Larry Dunn, a professional criminal from a family of professional criminals.
The Dunn criminal gang were what we would now call probably a local Irish cartel. They were the only real gang in town. They were quite powerful, they were very violent, and they were quite ruthless.
The drug squad knew Larry Dunn because he'd had more than 30 convictions, and there were 4 brothers in particular from the family who were working together. Larry Dunn was the biggest of them. He ran the biggest criminal network of importation of heroin.
Michael O'Sullivan is a former Assistant Commissioner of An Garda Síochána.
I joined the Guards in 1977, and in around 1979 to 80s, I was a young detective operating in Dublin City out of Dublin Castle.
Michael joined a team tasked with cracking Ireland's heroin trade and bringing down Larry Dunn.
Prior to what they now call the heroin epidemic, the drug scene really was mainly hippies and a small trickle of hard drugs. The tsunami of heroin suddenly hit Dublin. The police weren't prepared for it, the communities weren't prepared for it. It went from bad to disastrous overnight.
Heavy drug deal was going on. Many people died, families were destroyed and communities were ripped apart.
Brendan O'Brien, former journalist with Today Tonight in RTE.
Brendan produced an investigation that for the first time showed Ireland the effect Larry Dunn's heroin was having in Dublin.
The drug scene that I'm describing and that the programme revealed was totally unknown to the wider public.
About 2/3 of Dublin's heroin is brought in by the big commercial pushers. One group in particular controlled most of it.
Heroin was so widespread, it was growing at such a pace that there was probably about 5,000 serious heroin addicts. What was clear to me was, when I talked to these people, that they wanted their story told.
Like, it's hell on earth for anyone that goes on heroin now. Life is fucked, finished.
The more I talked to people and looked at what they were doing, the more I realised that this was a life and death issue for an awful lot of people.
I doubt we'd ever get on. So what do you see up ahead in the future?
Dying.
Nobody knew anything about heroin and heroin sales in 1979, including the criminals. It was just a completely new phenomenon. Open dealing in the flat complexes and on the street corners, their kids going to school, looking at dealers who were supplying heroin to their children, who who were attracting other criminals and other drug users. It was a learning curve for everybody. You learned on the street, and the people on the street learned on the street. The drug squad at the time consisted of a sergeant and 7 or 8 men. I realised how fast the problem was growing.
Michael now began to study this new criminal underworld, and the man at its heart, Larry Dunn.
Larry Dunn was part of a very large family from the south inner city, born into an Ireland that was, grindingly poor, and his particular background was especially poor. The family brought in an income by selling clothes on a stall on Francis Street. Because their father was involved in crime, their uncles were involved in crime as well. It was more or less inevitable that the Dunn boys would also become involved in crime, and they became quite well known to the guards from an early age for carrying out things like stealing cash and shoplifting. And of the 10 Dunn boys, all of them bar 2 ended up in various reform schools. Larry himself spent time in a reform school in County Offaly, and really by the 1970s they ran a very well organised robbery gang, and that was their main occupation.
From the late 60s, early 70s, there'd been an upsurge in nosin-related crime. Initially you had paramilitary groups robbing banks and other sources of income, but then ordinary criminals realised how easy it was, so they got in on the act. So you had an upsurge in armed robberies in the 1970s, and detection rates fell quite dramatically.
Larry Dunn seized the opportunity to cash in.
Larry Dunn and his criminal gang were responsible for a lot of bank robberies, jewellery robberies. They would travel throughout the country committing crime.
But armed robbery became an increasingly risky business.
One really influential event occurred in 1980 when 2 Gardaí were shot dead during an armed robbery in Ballahadreen. At that point, a lot of resources were put into the guards, and the guards were told that they had to clamp down on these armed robbery gangs.
The Gardaí managed to get their act together, and they set up an emergency response unit. Those units could respond within literally 3 or 4 minutes to a report of a bank robbery. So more and more people got caught robbing banks, and penalties increased. So people began to move into other areas of activity which were less risky.
Larry Dunn needed a new way to make money, and events unfolding thousands of miles away gave him the opportunity he needed.
As Gardaí began to clamp down on armed robbery gangs all over Ireland, 2 very significant events took place internationally. You had the revolution in Iran, and you had the Russians invading Afghanistan.
The aristocracy there, who owned vast wealth, turned their wealth into something that would make them get their money out fast. They turned it into heroin, they sold it in Europe, and Europe was flooded with heroin.
So conditions were really perfect in that sense for Larry Dunn and his group, who were transitioning really from armed robbery into the drugs trade.
Larry Dunn at the time and his gang had connections with the UK, and he saw the profits that were being made. In around 79 to 80, he began with a number of associates to bring heroin into the Irish market.
Larry Dunn knew exactly where he wanted to sell it, in Dublin's inner city, where he grew up.
My name is Mick Rafferty. Since the early 70s I've been a community activist, mainly in the north inner city. I grew up in the Docklands in Sheriff Street, which was a complex of flats. The docks were booming. My father was a docker, his grandfather was a docker. But there was a very sudden change with containerisation in the 60s. Within the space of a very short time, there was almost total unemployment.
Well, you had to work. There was other men outside to take a job. You had to pick out your own way of living in life. Otherwise, you go hungry.
The state seemed to adopt the attitude that people were in the way of progress. That was the cause of a lot of issues that arose, a lot of alienation of communities, particularly disaffected youth who were still behaving, to some extent, as if they could leave school and get a job. So they were young, vulnerable, and ripe for manipulation by criminal elements.
Now Larry Dunn flooded the flat complexes of this vulnerable community with heroin.
In the early 80s, it was one of the central places where they sold heroin. And dealers came from all over the city to sell drugs here because it became known as the place.
Children saw addicts shooting up on the balconies, the stairs, even the playgrounds.
They come to the flats because the main supplies was there.
We have seen these addicts come in here in the middle of this playground, and the young children here, and have been injecting themselves.
My name is Anne Buckley. I grew up in Fatima Mansions during the 80s and 90s. In 19, I started smoking heroin. It was a difficult time. The women and the families, their minds were consumed with the chaos that was going on, all the drug dealing.
Michael O'Sullivan and his colleagues in the drug squad struggled to police these communities.
Big challenge was that because they focused in the inner city of Dublin, they used flat complexes and lookouts. It was very, very challenging, very difficult to get up close and personal to identify who the dealer was and seize the drugs.
Complexes were a favourite spot because most of them were built around a central square. Teresa's Gardens, for example, or Hardwick Street flats. It's almost like a theatre. You've got these apartments, you've got balconies, and people can look out and chat to each other. You've also got very few entrances, so it's very easy to keep an eye out if the Gardaí are coming along, for example.
They became more innovative and more strategically placed in what you would call mini fortresses with steel gates and steel shutters and windows.
It was clear to Michael that Larry Dunn was responsible for the unfolding heroin epidemic. But gathering enough evidence to arrest him was a challenge. Dunn's nickname said it all.
Larry used to say, Larry doesn't carry.
He wouldn't carry the drugs.
Larry doesn't carry, he had everybody else carrying.
Cracking Larry Dunn's drug dealing ring required a new approach. For the first time in Irish drugs policing history, detectives from the National Police Service were to be sent undercover.
They decided that one way of dealing with it was to pretend to be addicts, and then once they bought it, they could nab the person selling it to them. And they were called the Mockies because they were mock addicts.
Nobody had been employed in an undercover capacity working in drugs in Ireland. Myself and the people that I worked with had the advantage of the local knowledge. We were from Dublin and we understood the local geography. I was young and small and skinny. I was just an average guy, so I just blended in, I guess. You were dropped in the deep end with the people you worked with and told to make the best of it. It was a dangerous, challenging environment.
Michael posed as a drug user and hit the streets of Dublin.
You went out to infiltrate groups and figure out where the drugs were, who was selling them, how much of it was around. It was about putting the pieces of the jigsaw together, figuring who was who and where the money was coming from and where the money was going and how the heroin was getting in. In dealing with drug dealers, you had to be convincing, you had to look like you needed heroin, you really to be on your guard for a change in the mood of the situation.
You want gear, right? Just go up to a flat, right? And you just bring up your money, right? And you can get it straight away like that, and then you just go out and use it.
2 or 3 minutes is a long time to be on your own in any location. In those days, you did this type of work without a radio, without a firearm, so you had nothing to sort of protect yourself. So frequently you would meet drug dealers, and so you frequently found yourself in a back alley off some side street. Backup was really no good to you because they wouldn't find you in that space of time. You took certain risks and it became an occupational hazard. When a move was made to arrest them, some of the people I worked with were assaulted quite badly, stabbed with syringes, got their hands scarred, pieces of flesh bitten off. In the ensuing struggle, violence was just part and parcel of what went on.
40 years on, Ireland's modern drug squad owes its existence to Michael's team of Mockies.
Angela Willis, Detective Chief Superintendent at the Garda National Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau. The basic principles that were developed back then by the original drug squad have grown to what we have today here in this covert bureau, which is the Garda National Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau, the Mockies. I think they demonstrated a desire to tackle the issue and a willingness to acknowledge that this was a significant issue that wasn't going to go away without an appropriate response.
Every day Michael spent undercover as a drug user revealed more about the mechanics of Larry Dunn's heroin operation.
His customer base had greatly increased because the more heroin he sold, the more people got on heroin. The numbers of addicts had greatly increased, and he was making greater profits.
He would allow them use heroin for free, they would run up debts, and he could force them then to go on these courier trips to various parts of Europe and bring his heroin back into Ireland. He then used the same tactic really when he was starting off drug dealing. He would give potential customers of his free drugs, and because he knew that once they took the heroin once or twice, they'd very soon get hooked and they would be back again and again. There were also very few other people dealing heroin at that time, so his investment in that young person by giving them free drugs, that investment really came back to him rather than going back to, some other rival drugs gang.
Larry Dunn had Dublin's inner city in his grip. Meanwhile, he built himself a lavish lifestyle.
He wore very expensive clothes, Armani suits, soft leather shoes. When he was in his pomp, he was making a lot of money, estimated to be about £10,000 per week at one point. And he really embraced this whole lifestyle of the wealthy gang leader. He drove luxury cars. When he was banned from driving, he was able to employ a chauffeur.
Today, the Criminal Assets Bureau gives the state power to seize wealth from known criminals. But in the 1980s, it had yet to be established. Despite Dunn's long list of convictions, his huge wealth was beyond the reach of Michael and the police.
We had a huge disadvantage. If a guy was caught with 20 grand in his house and you couldn't say that was from dealing, well then he got the 20 grand back. It's as simple as that. And if he bought a big car and he never worked in his life, Larry Dunn, to my knowledge, in all the years I never knew him to work. These people flaunted their wealth in a community that was devastated. Again, that only heightened the feelings that these people were making money from the misery of and the suffering of their kids.
Larry Dunn's heroin now drove a surge in other types of crime, as drug users broke the law to fund their new habit.
They only did two things. They went out to rob, to make money, to buy drugs, to inject themselves when they got it.
How much a day does it cost you to feed your habit? Probably £100.
Well, where do you get £100 a day?
I couldn't say that.
It would take 100 quid a day to feed your habit. So you can imagine the extent of the criminality that generated.
With drugs, you had people, particularly young people, who were robbing from their own families. They were desperate for money. They'd rob from next door neighbour, they'd rob from elderly people, anyone that was vulnerable.
Apart from money, what else did they steal from you?
They took me shorts, me new shorts.
People wouldn't open their doors. People were afraid to go to the shops. Elderly people were afraid. It was crazy. It was scary.
People were preying on each other. So it created huge tension in communities.
People robbing houses, flats, muggings. It was complete desperation.
People don't take the problem seriously until it hits them. I remember about 6 months ago talking to some of the families here, some of the parents, and they didn't realise that a problem was going to start.
Michael could now see how Larry Dunn's heroin dealers had infiltrated entire inner city communities.
Some of them were quite brazen, like dealing from their flats. So what you'd have is a queue of people going in to deal. They would shoot up on the stairways.
The community responded by coming together to attempt to drive the dealers out.
We had drug addicts from everywhere. We just got together and said, like, enough was enough, and tried to do something about it for the sake of our children that was getting brought up in the area.
The Concerned Parents Against Drugs was an attempt to have a coordinated pushback against the drug pushers. What you're dealing with is children, and we're talking about children between 12, 13, 14, up to the age of 24 or 5, killing themselves.
As we see people who are on drugs, it's only sinking into
It's not until it actually happens to you that you believe.
Yeah.
And then it's too late.
It was a mass meeting. People said what they thought. Names were given, who was pushing, who was stealing, and it was agreed these people had to leave the community.
One such meeting was organised by two anti-drug campaigners, Mick Rafferty and local politician Tony Gregory.
Each year, over the last few years, 10 young people, mainly in the inner city areas of Dublin, have died from heroin use. And this year, already so far this year, 10 have died.
One of the meetings in Rutland Street School, the man himself, Larry Dunn, came in and I was chairing the meeting and he stood beside me. And I can tell you I was a bit nervous, And he started plamazing the audience by saying things like, you all know me. I'm like yourself. A lot of yous are street traders and dealers. So that's all I'm doing. I'm not doing anything different from what you're doing. And Tony, who was in the audience, stood up and stood beside me. And he said, Dunn, Mr. Dunn, you're dealing in debt and chaos. And you should be ashamed of yourself coming from the same class of people as they are now destroying.
When their prayers failed, the community took matters into their own hands.
We would gather information, we'd invite them to a meeting to present the evidence and ask them to stop. And if they didn't stop them, we'd march on them.
They had watched for years people on balconies selling drugs, kids dying, and nobody cared.
We feel that shortly it'll be impossible for a youngster to get through adolescence without encountering pressure to use drugs.
You sympathised with the communities who were taking matters into their own hands. Sometimes they get misinformation, and sometimes they got it wrong.
The trouble started this afternoon when a number of them occupied the house and barricaded themselves in. They say the house was being used for drug pushing. The family who'd been living there had to be given a Garda escort out of the area.
But the community's rage at Larry Dunn proved vital to Michael's investigation.
The communities were a great source of support because they knew what was going on and they knew who was selling. They knew where they were selling, and in many cases they knew who they were selling for, and they had no loyalties to these drug dealers. And the local communities would say, look, the guy down the road has a brand new car now and he's moving house and he hasn't worked a day in his life, and my kids are on heroin.
You just knew that these were the family that were known to bring in the drugs, and the women and the men would be very angry at them. Don't fucking say hello to me, you. How fucking dare you? The cheek of you to think you can say hello and everything's normal and this is what you're doing.
So people came forward to tell you, what are you going to do about these guys? It was a source of up-to-date information coming from the communities.
The communities weren't the only source of Michael's information. The dealers themselves showed little loyalty to Larry Dunn.
If you look at the nature of the Garda operation, the information that it had, it knew where to find Larry's drugs and so on. And you would have to say that some of the men around Larry were actually supplying information to the guards.
With this wealth of intelligence, Michael could now aim higher than the dealers on the street.
Our aim was to work up through the channel of distribution to target where the main source of heroin was coming in, to try and take people out at the top of the pyramid. Larry Dunn and some of his criminal associates, they have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky once.
And then Michael got his break when he discovered a weakness to Larry Dunn's operation that could turn the odds in his favour.
A lot of mistakes that some of his people made was using heroin, and it made them careless.
One of his problems, and which really turned out to be his Achilles heel, was that every time a courier brought drugs back from Europe for him, he would test the drugs himself. He would actually sniff some heroin. Larry and the men who were close to him became hooked on drugs.
I think there was an air of invincibility in their mindset, that the people on the ground will get caught, the people who live in the inner city will get caught, the people who are at the front line selling drugs and who are storing the drugs, they'll all get caught, but we're 2 steps back. And I think they just got comfortable and they got complacent.
All Michael needed was for one of Larry Dunn's generals to make a mistake.
One of the inner circle met with me and sold me drugs. He was later sentenced to 7 years. It put them on the back foot. They started to make mistakes. And then it got to the stage that there were more of the inner circle caught than there were free. And it put them under increased pressure. They sort of became paranoid, and it was a level of distrust among everyone they dealt with. He needed that network. He needed to be able to have trusted lieutenants. He was running out of allies. No longer was it a smooth, well-oiled machine.
Drug addiction was finally undermining Larry Dunn's own inner circle. Michael could now build a more detailed picture of how the gang operated.
The heroin trade worked in the form of a pyramid. Somebody at the top of the pyramid, a senior figure, Larry Dunn, who gave the orders and coordinated the sale of drugs. He had his people in Amsterdam and his people in London and Birmingham, where they had close contacts with the people who were bringing the heroin in from Afghanistan and from Pakistan. He would arrange the price through his close associates. Couriers would bring the drugs in. Somebody who would be very trusted would meet them. They would cut up the drugs, give it to dealers on the ground who had one foot as an addict and another foot as a dealer. They were selling to feed their own habit, and they would then pass the money on to the guy at the next tier. He in turn would give it to the guy at the next tier. He would send it up. It would eventually get up to the money man, and the money and the profits generated would be used to bring in more drugs.
But what Michael really needed was evidence to link Larry, who doesn't carry, to the actual possession of drugs. Police got their chance. Intelligence said drugs were being stored at Dunn's family home in Rathfarnham.
All roads led to Larry Dunn in those days. On the day of the search, the detective sergeant had got a drugs warrant to search Larry's house in Rathfarnham. Simultaneously, a jewellery robbery had taken place, and the serious crime squad believed that the jewellery may have been in Larry's house. So the serious crime squad arrived to search Larry's house for jewellery, and a half an hour later the drug squad arrived.
When Gardaí raided his corporation house, they found heroin, cocaine and cannabis resin.
There was a cocktail of drugs found there. There was £60,000 worth of heroin, cocaine and cannabis found in a pillowcase in his daughter's bedroom.
For Larry Dunn, this was a rare but crucial mistake.
And there was a number of other bits and pieces and cash found, but more importantly, the heroin was found, and therefore there was evidence that he could be charged with. It's very rare for somebody at the top of a pyramid to be in possession of the drugs. I think Larry was so busy at the time trying to coordinate everything he was doing. You could say he dropped his guard. It was great for the ordinary people who saw this guy on a pedestal, proving that crime pays. That's what he frequently said. And a lot of young criminals saw him as a role model. It was a game changer for the young heroin industry that Larry, who doesn't carry, was caught.
Larry Dunn was charged with possession of drugs, but the laws of the time meant he was released pending his trial.
One of the frustrating things for the communities, they couldn't figure out how guys were getting arrested and they were back on the street the next day, but that was the bail law. He realised that worst case scenario, he might go to prison. He needed to make as much money as possible to build a nest egg.
He was on bail for the best part of 2.5 years, during which time he accumulated huge sums of money and increased his activities.
He reorganized his criminal enterprise. He then decided that he needed to relocate.
He was able to buy a house in Sandyford. He was able to pay with that with cash.
No Dublin criminal in the past 20 years had managed to put money aside like that and move up and move out. So he bought Gorse Rock, which was a beautiful location overlooking the Wicklow Mountains. It was a little bit like a fortress. It was going to be more difficult to get to him, but it wasn't over till it was over, and the organisation was running a very profitable enterprise, and they weren't going to go away that easy.
Dunn ramped up his operation. He expanded from the inner city into South County Dublin, bringing the drug epidemic with him.
Not only are we talking about something that is, if you like, in tough working class enclaves, this was much more widespread than that.
Dunleary, like other parts of the city, has witnessed a heroin epidemic. Young people dying without the public really knowing.
He would have controlled, I would say, about 95% of the heroin trade. People from the outskirts interacting with people from the inner city were trying out this drug, and the tragedy was this: people started using heroin, it's next to impossible to get off it. So his trade just mushroomed.
I watched my friends for years. I saw how long it took them to get addicted. I woke up sick. My body starts shaking. You can't sit in your own skin. It's like spiders crawling all inside you, but yet you're sweating, you're vomiting, you're soiling yourself, and you can't control it. So your normal bodily functions have been taken over by a substance. So if you don't have that substance, that opiate, you can't function.
You're not living, you're just existing. It's a filthy world.
At a human level, talking to a pregnant woman or somebody who's injecting themselves, endangering their lives, was very hard to watch. But professionally, it was exactly what I wanted to be able to show. Now, that sounds a bit hard, but I wanted people to see the true reality.
In 1982, Dunn was still on bail, and local politician Tony Gregory fought to make Dunn's drug epidemic a political issue.
The community is certainly playing its part and will continue to play its part to destroy the heroin barons, as they're called.
He and Mick Rafferty secured a meeting with Irish Prime Minister Charles Haughey and demanded action.
And we gave him the results of what was called the Bradshaw report, which indicated that 10% of young people over the summer had become addicted to heroin, and it was spreading. And we gave him the name of the people, the Dunns, that we thought were primarily responsible, Larry Dunn in particular. And Haughey picked up the phone to the then commissioner, Patrick McLaughlin, and said, "Patrick, I want you to do something about this problem. And I want it done urgently. I don't want any delay." And he put it down. And he just said to us, "Now, lads, we'll get some action done on solving this problem."
Once Tony Gregory went to Charlie Haughey and complained about the heroin epidemic, the Garda efforts were really ramped up then into the men around Larry Dunn. A lot of surveillance was carried out on them, people who would courier in drugs for them from abroad, people who would sell the drugs on the streets. So you really have this sense of the net closing in on Larry Dunn.
Dublin, 1983. For 3 years, a heroin epidemic has engulfed the city.
10% of young people over the summer had become addicted to heroin.
Police know the man responsible.
All roads led to Larry Dunn. He would have controlled 95% of the heroin trade.
And now they have the evidence to bring him to court.
There was £60,000 worth of heroin, cocaine and cannabis found in a pillowcase in his daughter's bedroom.
In April 1983, Dunn finally faced trial for possession of drugs found at his home in Rathfarnham.
Larry Dunn went on trial before a judge and jury in the Central Criminal Court in Dublin on charges relating to the possession and supply of illegal drugs.
There was a lot of media hype and pressure in relation to the trial. He was eventually coming to court.
At the time, a conviction required all members of the jury to agree on the verdict.
At the end of the day, the jury failed to agree, and the jury were discharged, and another date set for a retrial. So, Larry was free to go about his business until the next trial. There was a lot of speculation that people may be intimidated.
The guards who worked on the case always believed that Larry Dunn had actually tampered with the jury.
The jury were nobbled, basically. And that was one of the reasons why it was so important to get him and to send him down from the Gardaí point of view, from everyone's point of view, because otherwise, if these people are allowed to become a law unto themselves, well then, you know, the legitimacy of the state is undermined.
Before he went on trial again, the law was changed and the courts were able to accept majority verdicts then from juries. And what that really meant was, it meant that organised crime was less able to tamper with a jury.
By the time the second trial came along, the pressure had greatly intensified by community groups, a lot of media pressure. This was one of the most important criminals over the last number of years.
The game was probably up at that point, and he really knew that. It became very clear to him on day one of the trial that the evidence against him was just overwhelming.
On the first day of his trial, Dunn was granted bail to go for lunch.
And the fact that he got bail during his trial, to many people, was beyond belief. And it is beyond belief, because he had a track record as long as both your arms and legs.
He hatched the plan, and that plan was to abscond. He was able to, walk out of the court during lunchtime, go for his lunch. He got changed in the toilets in the pub, and really that was all he had to do. He was gone.
He had been in court to hear prosecuting counsel open the case, but after lunch failed to return.
There was outrage that he was let escape, and there was disbelief that he was let escape.
They essentially looked everywhere for him. They arrested about 40 people, raided about 40 houses looking for Larry Dunn. They weren't able to find him.
The search for him became nationwide, and police forces in other countries were also asked to look out for him.
Despite intensive efforts to find him, Larry Dunn remained at large, and community anger was growing.
We just couldn't understand how he was given bail. Extraordinary. And that was sort of flying in the face of justice. I remember one woman saying, these dealers are going to sleep on silk sheets while my daughter lies on a marble cold slab in the morgue. Where's the justice?
It was really embarrassing for the guards. They put in a huge effort over a period of several years to try and catch him and his gang. The embarrassment grew and the anger in political circles grew when the Garda effort to find him failed.
My personal views were that he would be caught because the guards were never going to give up. The investigations were never going to give up. He would be away for a while, but sooner or later he'd surface, and when he'd surface, we'd bring him back. It was difficult to convey that to the communities who felt cheated again.
And for 100 years he should have got. Right, that's enough. A lot of them, yeah, and anyone belongs to him.
Larry Dunn had disappeared, but the destruction he caused was all too visible.
For the wider audience, the Larry Dunn story was the story. But underneath that, the addiction continued and the horror stories continued, and it was still getting worse. There was probably about 5,000 serious heroin addicts.
Families were wiped out. Like my auntie lost 4 of her 5 children, all under the age of 30. Another neighbour lost 5 out of 7 of their children.
My boy was carrying for them all over at 12 years of age.
This is your boy now who's an addict?
Yes. So much potential lost to the person, the families, the community. Ireland, so many gifted, talented, really, really smart people died from the heroin epidemic. It's unnatural. It's on a scale that I may never fully get over.
This was a man who was really the godfather of heroin in Ireland. 40 years on, there are still thousands of heroin addicts in the country. Really the same areas that Larry Dunn targeted are the ones that have the worst heroin problem now.
Almost 2 years after he disappeared, there was still no sign of Larry Dunn. But Michael's instinct said he would resurface.
Larry was a homebird and he was a dub. He was laying low, assisted by trusted associates in the suburbs of Dublin.
Police did everything they could to make life for Dunn as difficult as possible.
In his absence, he had actually gone on trial. He became the first person in the state to be convicted in their absence before the Central Criminal Court.
Now a convicted criminal, Dunn took his cash and fled Ireland.
Larry ended up going to Spain. He hung out in places like Fungirola, Marbella, Malaga. He lived a lifestyle like the way a tourist would. He spent a lot of time on the beach. He exercised very regularly. He swam in the sea. He went for jogs very often. He also hung out in Irish bars quite a bit. He actually went from Spain to Thailand to try and kick his heroin habit. He underwent a treatment program out there.
But as one of Ireland's most wanted men, Dunn's fugitive lifestyle couldn't last.
And he was getting off a ferry at one point over in Portugal. A police officer checked his passport, suspected it was fake, took him into custody and raised the alarm. And when the Portuguese police checked with the Irish police, they obviously realised they had a big fish on their hands. They'd caught Larry Dunn.
Back in Ireland, it wasn't just a prison sentence waiting for Dunn. There was fury.
Dunn was led out of the court, flanked by a dozen uniformed gardaí and several armed detectives. The crowd shouted abuse and threw eggs, and at one stage the gate of the courthouse was slammed against the Garda van, causing minor damage.
He received a 14-year sentence, which was a very big sentence in those days. It was a sense of satisfaction to the people in the inner city, albeit limited satisfaction because they still had children who were heroin addicts, some of whom have died. Their families were destroyed. It was poor comfort to them.
I mean, we genuinely believed that once you got a few of the key dealers, the problem would ease.
It was certainly a significant moment. But I knew with Larry Dunn gone, he'd be replaced and we'd have to rebuild the investigation to focus on the next Larry Dunn.
The roots had been laid. To celebrate Larry Dunn being out of the picture was short-lived because other dealers simply emerged. And unless the cause of the problems are dealt with, you will get the reincarnation of the Larrys.
There's plenty more Larry Dunns around it, and everybody will have to stand together and root them all out. That's what I say.
If you focus so much on getting the big dealer and putting Mr. Big away, creates the illusion you've solved the problem, but of course you haven't. Miss Big gets replaced by a lot of little guys who make it even harder to get on top of the problem, and some of whom will eventually become big themselves.
No one knew this better than Dunn himself.
When Larry Dunn was being led away to start that 14-year prison term, he turned to journalists and said, if you think we're bad, wait till you see what's coming after us. And really, you'd have to say now that he was proven right.
He anticipated his own legacy by that phrase, that if you think I'm bad, you want to see what's coming. But he created what came after him.
The next generation were more cunning, certainly probably smarter. They had learned from the mistakes of the predecessors, and they had learned how to hone their skills in trying to avoid the police.
Throughout the 90s, these new gangs became increasingly violent, even assassinating an innocent journalist.
It was really only when Veronica Guerin was shot dead that we accepted, I think, as a country that we had a serious organised crime problem.
And that was the big wake-up call for the state. They realised that these guys are not just a threat to working class communities, they're actually a threat to the foundation, of the state.
As generations went on, they became more violent. People then started to get shot and contract killings, and it became more professional, more violent, more global, more sophisticated, and they became more wealthy.
The scene in Dublin's north inner city of the believe they may have discovered the murder scene so far cost 18 lives. Heavily involved in drug trafficking and violent crime.
The drugs trade then just really took off from the late 1990s. It was all types of drugs that had spread to all kinds of areas all over Ireland. And people of all the social classes were taking, heroin, cocaine, cannabis. We have too many crime gangs now to even name them all. The drugs trade has really spread all over the country, and the world has changed quite significantly from the time of Larry Dunn.
Larry Dunn was released from prison in 1995, but the law wasn't finished with him yet.
Larry Dunn displaying very visible signs of wealth. There was nothing they could do about that at that time. We didn't have legislation which allows for the confiscation of assets. They didn't have legislation specifically enacted to deal with the drug situation.
In 1996, the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up to confiscate the proceeds of crime.
The first thing that the Bureau did was to really target people like Larry Dunn, those old-time guys who had, built up property portfolios, who had, large sums of cash in the bank. That kind of, lavish lifestyle, high roller, being chauffeured around in an expensive car and buying a house in Sandyford for cash, that was all taken from him. Larry Dunn died in May 2020. He was aged 72 and he had been suffering from cancer for quite some time. His health was very poor, and really his personal circumstances were very poor indeed. He was actually living in a shed in his daughter's garden during the last years of his life.
Anne was in addiction for 17 years. She found a path to recovery following an attempt to take her own life.
And that's when I took charge of my life back. But I knew I had a lot of work to do. So I went into detox and treatment, trauma-informed treatment. I feel alive today. There's education today that I can avail of that I never had the opportunity. It wasn't there. I feed my brain and I give myself knowledge. That's what I do today.
For those who witnessed it firsthand, Larry Dunn's legacy is one of death and destruction.
My abiding memory is doing the interview with the guy shooting up, looking for a vein to put the needle in, and basically killing himself.
He pioneered organised drug distribution in Ireland. It was never there before. He put a structure on it. He brought in the product. And from that, people saw the market and followed on.
His legacy is a whole generation of young people who were lost. And if you go down to the memorial down in Buckingham Street and the Christmas tree at Christmas time, and you see all the names of kids who have died are put up on the tree, that's Larry's legacy. Larry, who doesn't carry, killed people. And his legacy is the grief of mothers and fathers, of course, who lost their kids because of drug addiction.
Young people were dying, communities were devastated. He was making profits. He was a mercenary. The people who worked with him were mercenaries. They didn't care.
I think the complexities of this case were quite unique. There were so many unknowns. It showed how cold and callous people could be.
I didn't really know what to think. I was 14 at the time.
It just all seemed a bit weird to me. Something you would see like on TV. Like it's not something that actually happens to like you and your family.
Whenever you put things together, you can just see it unraveling. He had made his mind up.
These two relationships that she was having with these two men were both fiery relationships.
You can see the wheelie bin caught up in the branches. This is so unusual, this has to be connected.
There was so many poignant moments where things could have ended so differently for Pat.
I was just wanting to know why he actually did it. I'm Morgan McCormick and I'm 19 and I'm from Newton Arts. I was really close to my dad growing up. When I went to work, I would try and pull sickies to go with him so I could just sit in like the wee creche area and play with all the wee toys and stuff. Growing up, I just was always clung to my dad. I was always daddy's little girl and he always called me Flossie. It's just like a father-daughter bond. It was always just me and him. My dad always picked me up to bring me to school. I got up around 7, got in the shower, straightened my hair, and then put my uniform on, put my blazer on, doing my tie. He would normally come around like 8ish. He didn't show up for ages. And we were just waiting. And then it just got to a point where I was like, oh, he's not here. So then my mum had to take me to school and I was a wee bit late. And I was telling my friends, like, it's really weird, my dad's not replying. My friends were all like, oh, that's not like him.
Hello, I'd like to report a missing person, please.
It was initially reported on Saturday the 1st of June and it was a work colleague of Mr. McCormick who had reported him missing. My name is Heather Campbell. I'm a Detective Chief Inspector in the PSNI. I was in a team of specialist investigators who primarily investigate any major incident or major crime. It was actually William McCormick, but he was known by everyone really as Pat McCormick. He was 55 years old in 2019, a father to 4 children. He worked as a care worker. And he also had a part-time job as a caretaker in one of the local churches. For the past while, he had been living back home at his parents' address in Saintfield. The local CID detectives were treating it as a missing person investigation and were carrying out all of the normal activities. You go and speak to the last person he was with, the last people he'd spoken to, his friends, his immediate family. The concern that police had escalated quite quickly. Mr. McCormick had just disappeared, hadn't made any contact with anyone, which is very unusual. He hadn't used any form of social media, he hadn't used any banking that was linked to him. Hadn't been reported as being involved in any incident, he wasn't in a hospital. And the people that were closest to him simply did not know where he was. It was highly unusual that he hadn't picked up his daughter from school on the Friday. He would do this every day. He would take her to school and collect her. Without any warning or notice, that just did not happen on the Friday.
I came home to the police being there after I got home from school and everything, just to talk to us and tell us he's filed as a missing person and stuff, and they were looking for him and trying to find his car and everything because they couldn't find his car at first. I didn't really believe any of it. I was 14 at the time, so I was just like holding on to all the hope I could. So I just thought of it as, he's just being silly, he's not actually missing, sort of thing. Something you would see like on TV. Like, it's not something that actually happens to like you and your family. I was like, he's around somewhere, like they will find him eventually.
Heather began her investigation by building a timeline of Pat's final movements.
It became clear that Mr. McCormick had last been seen on Thursday, the 30th of May, 2019. That was when he was at home at his parents' address in Saintfield. At around 5 to 9 in the evening, he had received a phone call. His family would report that it was a short phone call. I think it just lasted just over 2 minutes. From what they could hear, it sounded like the female was making the call was maybe upset or distressed.
Pat had recently separated from his wife following a relationship with another woman, Leslie Ann Dodds.
My dad cheated on my mum. He obviously moved out of the house and started living with my granny. So I knew of Leslie Ann. I met her a couple times before I knew any of that.
Pat's mother overheard his call. She believed he was speaking to Leslie Ann, who lived 8 miles away in Comber.
After that very short phone call, Mr. McCormick had made the decision to travel to Comber. Leslie Ann Dodds was 20 years old. She had met Pat through work. They worked together as care assistants, and during that time, a relationship had developed between them. It seemed like the relationship had been going on for a number of months. The exact sort of reasons why that relationship started wasn't necessarily clear to police. There was a significant age gap between Pat and Leslie Ann.
Heather knew that Leslie Ann was potentially the last person to see Pat, and they had to talk to her.
She actually reported that she hadn't seen him since Tuesday the 20th of May and had not been in contact with him, which was probably the first point where police started to think there's something not quite right here in terms of what we're being told.
This conflicted with Pat's mother's account of the pair talking the night he disappeared.
We were starting to get information from phone data, from witnesses, from colleagues and friends, which clearly, a lot of people knew they were in a relationship, and there would have been daily contacts between Leslie Ann Dodds and Pat, certainly up until the Thursday when he went missing. We also were keen to then check Leslie Ann Dodds' address in Comber because we believed that that was the location that he was travelling to on the Thursday night. That was met with some suspicious resistance. She just didn't understand why police would want to check there for him, and she certainly wasn't willing to come to meet police to let us do so. And again, that was a bit of a red warning flag to police that something's not quite. This isn't how a normal girlfriend or friend or partner would react to someone that was missing.
My name's Jennifer Ray, and I'm a detective inspector in the PSNI. Leslie Ann wouldn't come over to allow them into the flat. Her mother had told the police that Leslie Ann Dodds didn't want to, in case she got arrested. Her mother had said that she would give permission for them to force entry. So a period of time later, the local police and team officers then had to force their way into Leslie Ann Dodds' house because they had no other means of accessing the property at that stage.
It was a second floor flat in a multi-occupied building, and it was right on Castle Street, right in the heart of Comber, on one of the main busy roads through the town.
There was a very strong smell of bleach in the communal hallway as they entered the building. Whenever they went up to Leslie Ann's flat, there was no sign of a disturbance and nothing really that would suggest that anything had happened and that Pat wasn't actually in that house at that stage.
It was unheated, there was no electricity, so it was quite clear that no one had been living there, perhaps for weeks before that.
Leslie Ann's behaviour wasn't that of a concerned girlfriend, and detectives soon discovered a reason why. There was another man in Leslie Ann Dodd's life.
David Gill was Leslie Ann Dodd's fiance. I think they'd been together 4 or 5 years before this happened. I don't know how long that the affair was going on, but there were suggestions from Pat McCormick's wife that this had been going on from round about Christmas, so maybe 5 months. It seemed to have been quite a tempestuous relationship, as was Leslie Ann's relationship with David Gill.
David is 26 years old. He was unemployed and lived just outside Cumber by himself on a family farm building there. The next piece of information that police became aware of was that Mr. McCormick had actually contacted police on that Thursday evening when he travelled to Cumber.
Police Service of Northern Ireland, can I take your name, please?
It's William McCormick.
Okay, and how may I help you?
I'll tell you what it is. I'm going to sound silly here, but I'll tell you what it is. My girlfriend called down to see me here in Cumber, but I was down earlier and I seen her ex-boyfriend's van hiding in a, scared of him, maybe waiting on me, coming out of her flat to give me a beating, if you know what I mean. And just wondering, getting police standing there waiting for me because he's a bad boy, so he is, you know.
Right.
He's definitely hiding somewhere, like, I'm just a bit concerned.
It's quite unusual to have a direct contact with police immediately before someone goes missing. So this was really critical to our investigation and a real key piece of evidence.
He's threatened me before, so he has.
He has hit you?
He's threatened to do me in, yeah.
He threatened to do you in, and did you report that at the time?
No, I didn't, because I didn't want any hassle, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I just go down there and check his van still there, so well, I just need to be very careful, so I do, that's all. But he's a big brute sort of a fella.
You ring me back if there is any danger at all, or if he is with the van, or he threatens you in any way.
I'll ring you back if there's any danger, so well, thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much anyway.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, bye-bye, bye-bye.
This conversation gave us a really good insight in terms of just how Pat was feeling that evening, what prompted him to phone police, what was going through his mind, what thoughts he was having, and also a bit of a background in terms of potentially who this other boyfriend was. It's obviously very relevant to a missing person investigation whenever it's uncovered that there is a fear on behalf of the victim, and also in terms of potentially threats that have been made previously. So it was very vital that we tried to garner anyone that would have any kind of threat or hostility towards Pat at this point. We didn't have strong evidence to support that he had come to harm. Obviously, it was a hypothesis being followed, but there absolutely was evidence that he had come to Leslie Ann Dodd's apartment potentially to meet David Gill there, or certainly that he was present there, and that there was involvement of Leslie Ann Dodds. So the decision was made that both David Gill and Leslie Ann Dodds would be arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. This then allowed us to bring them into police custody, to carry out whatever searches we needed to post-arrest, and also to get their formal account in terms of what had actually happened.
Just 3 days after Pat's disappearance, detectives made a decisive move.
Police then attended David Gill's home address, where they located Leslie Ann Dodds and David Gill in the early hours of the morning on the 3rd of June. And they were both arrested and brought to the police station.
Pat McCormick was last seen here in Cumber on Thursday evening. A 26-year-old man and a 20-year-old woman were both arrested on suspicion of kidnapping.
Heather knew they couldn't hold the pair for long, and every hour that passed left detectives more concerned for Pat's welfare.
Usually the information would be growing in terms of intelligence as to why he had been kidnapped or abducted or taken, where he may have gone, what the motive behind it would have been. But this was quite an unusual case because there wasn't any of that. Mr. McCormick had just disappeared. There hadn't been any demand or menaces for money or anything associated with the kidnapping.
Pat was now missing for more than 72 hours. Time wasn't on their side, and detectives were increasingly worried Pat may have come to harm.
The team were working flat out, speaking to witnesses, gathering CCTV, and there was still a lot of early information, which was really helpful for the investigative team. I think we had in excess of over 80 different sites of CCTV that we were interested in and around Cumber. There's also, I think, in excess of 170 witnesses identified in those early days, so there was a lot of people to talk to.
Heather was hoping CCTV would allow her to piece together the movements of both Pat and David Gill the night Pat disappeared.
CCTV was viewed in and around the area of Castle Street in Comber. Behind me is the building where Leslie Ann's flat is located, and also Castle Street. And we know that David Gill had parked his transit van a little bit away from the flat, then walked up Castle Street, in through the archway and into the property. We know Pat drove up and then left the area. He returned. He parked just off to my right here on High Street. And then we see him on CCTV crossing Castle Street in through the same archway, and that is the last sighting of Pat McCormick alive. 43 minutes later, we see David Gill exiting the same location and walking away from this scene.
Heather and Jennifer suspected that there was an altercation between the two men while they were in the flat, but they had no proof and hoped technology could provide some.
Quite often, phones would be seized as part of an arrest and give an insight in terms of relationships and connections with people. Phone data is really important to any major crime investigation. It obviously provides both geographic location, but it also provides a picture as to not just how people were moving, but how they were interacting, what phone calls were made, what phone calls weren't answered, what attempts were made to phone people.
The investigation turned to cell site analysis to build a timeline of movements of both the suspects and Pat that night.
Cell site analysis is the way in which we are able to locate the general area of a mobile phone from the phone records that it's created historically. Then, depending on the case, we would use radio frequency surveying for the finite detail as to whether that cell provided coverage at a specific location or not. My name is Paul Hope, and I'm a cell site analysis and radio frequency surveying expert.
Paul can use the data from mobile phone cell sites to establish the location of a particular mobile phone.
When you look at the call data, it appeared as if Dodd's phone had been phoning the victim shortly after 9:30.
This was the phone call heard by Pat's mother, but it wasn't the only communication between Pat and Leslie Ann that night.
This is a detailed log of all the communications on the night in question between Leslie Ann Dodds, Pat McCormick and David Gill. The call logs show both the phone messages and phone calls between Leslie Ann Dodds and Pat McCormick. So this is obviously in direct contradiction to the account that Leslie Ann Dodds first gave to police and then continued to give to police. We were aware of these inconsistencies, and we believe that Leslie Ann Dodds was withholding the truth, potentially lying. And again, this was a real flag and warning sign for us as investigators. So we can see from these call logs that we know on that evening she was in phone contact with Pat, but she also critically was in contact with David Gill, and that shows a level of orchestration and really Leslie Ann's involvement.
As the night wore on, the messages to Pat became more persuasive.
At 21 minutes past 9 on the 30th of May, and it stated, "I've left him on way to mine, do you want to stay at mine?" Pat then replies to Leslie Ann Dodds 4 minutes later saying, "Hi, you told me you wanted nothing to do with me. I think you're trying to set me up to get a kicking, are you?" And Leslie Ann Dodds sends a further message to Pat to inform him that "I've left him for you. Please come and stay at mine. You wanted me to make a choice, so I've left him for you." So again, this clearly plays into there's a third party at play here, and also again potentially some kind of motive in terms of what has then happened and why Pat has simply disappeared. Over the next sort of 10 minutes or so shows a lot of back and forth between Leslie Ann Dodds and Pat McCormick, and it's very clear that Pat's very unsure as to what Leslie Ann's trying to do. Pat then after 9:30 texts, "Hi, I am on my way."
While Pat was on the move, so too were the phones belonging to Leslie Ann and David Gill.
Around 21:30 on the night, Gill's and Dodd's phones, not necessarily users, have stopped using cells that provide coverage at Gill's home address and have moved together, mirrored movement, to cells that provide coverage here at Dodd's address. Gill's phone detached from the network and was potentially turned off. Didn't come back on again until just before midnight, by which time he was back at his home address at Ballyglicorn Road. I'm saying he turned his phone off. There are numerous reasons why a phone can detach from the network. It can be battery failure, but you need to look at how often does this target phone turn off. In this case, it was unusual.
While both David Gill and Leslie Ann Dodd's phone were in Comber, only David Gill was seen on CCTV, driving his blue transit van.
The CCTV showed David Gill arriving in Comber and entering Leslie Ann Dodd's flat, and we knew from phone data that both David Gill and Leslie Ann's phones were believed to be at that location, which obviously prompted the question, why was Leslie Ann Dodds not seen on the CCTV footage with David Gill? Leslie Ann Dodds was clearly elsewhere, and potentially her phone was not with her or on her person.
David Gill had taken Leslie Ann's phone with him to Comber. Detectives believe she remained at Gill's house, from where she was able to keep in touch with Pat using a laptop and a landline.
Pat McCormick had sent a message to Leslie Ann Dodds at 10:06, saying simply, "Hi, ring me." So at this point, it's quite clear that Pat is obviously very anxious and worried and wants direct conversation by way of a live phone call with Leslie Ann, and he's not getting that. Someone did not want to reply by way of a phone call. A matter of minutes later, Pat again texts Leslie Ann saying, "I want to talk to you on the phone first. If you don't, I'm not coming up." So that then results in quite an angry reply. Pat then replies to that message saying, "Hi, no problem, that suits me." Pat then phones his mum to say, "Look, I'm on my way back home, don't wait up for me, leave out a key," and gives every indication that he's going to leave Comber and travel home and spend the night there.
At this point, he made the 101 call saying he was concerned David Gill may be laying in wait.
Well, what is it you want the police to do?
I want them to stand in the road till I go upstairs. All I want is to get through the door upstairs into their flat. That's all I want. It'll only be a few minutes.
However, while he was talking to police, someone was trying to call him from a landline with a withheld number.
The next sequence of communications are very interesting. So there's a number of phone calls from David Gill's landline, which was withheld. At the same time, there's a number of messages from Leslie Ann Dodd's mobile to Pat, and they were trying to tell Pat that it was Leslie Ann trying to phone him from a withheld number.
Detectives believe the two suspects were attempting to deceive Pat into believing Leslie Ann was at the flat, so that he would call to the property. Their plan worked.
Pat sent a text message saying, "I'm coming into Comber in 2 minutes."
Less than 5 minutes later, Pat is then seen on CCTV entering through the archway in Comber towards Leslie Ann Dodd's apartment. 43 minutes later, David Gill is seen exiting through that same archway, and there is no sign of Pat.
Less than a day after arresting Leslie Ann Dodds and David Gill, this new evidence convinced Heather and Jennifer that Pat had been lured to the flat and then killed. A missing person inquiry now became a murder investigation, with one very unusual feature.
I had never been involved in a murder case where we didn't have the body of the deceased. It is quite a different investigation because there's two real tracks to it. Recovering the body of Mr. McCormick, partly for evidential value and to prove the case of the murder. But also, at the heart of this, you have a family who still have their loved one, their father, their son missing, and they want to know what has happened to him.
There are cases where there have been convictions for murder where no body has ever been recovered. It is more challenging, but it isn't impossible.
We further arrested both Leslie Ann Dodds and David Gill on suspicion of murder, and it was declared as a no-body murder investigation at that point.
On Monday, a man and woman, both in their 20s, were arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. Last night, the PSNI said they'd been rearrested on suspicion of murder. The police also said they'd been granted an additional 36 hours to question the man and woman. Although no body has been found, police now believe Pat McCormick has been murdered.
I came home to the police being there, and they said, like, we need to talk to the whole family, so we had to wait for everyone to come home from work and stuff. So everyone got home, we were all sitting in the sunroom, and our two family liaisons, the girl, she turned around and she told us that it was being turned into a murder investigation. My older brother Mackenzie, he was very hopeful and he didn't believe it. We all had so much tension around us, and it didn't feel nice. My mum was on the edge because she had kids to look after. But if it's being turned into a murder investigation, she was going to have to grieve him while looking after 4 kids as well.
Still in police custody, detectives began to question David Gill and Leslie Ann. Not about kidnapping this time, but murder.
They both had denied any involvement in the disappearance of Pat, and Leslie Ann had in fact gone further and said she hadn't been in contact with him, which we knew was untrue.
Leslie Ann Dodds had provided the account that she had known Pat for approximately 8 months at that stage. She met him through her employment. She said they weren't in a relationship, and that she didn't realise that he was missing until Pat's mother had contacted her on the Friday morning.
We could see that there was inconsistencies in both their accounts, which again, was highly suspicious. In interview, David Gill initially stated that he had had no contact with Pat McCormick and that he didn't believe that there was a relationship between Pat and Leslie Ann Dodds. He then, after further questioning, changed that position and said he maybe was aware of it, but he didn't believe there was a relationship, and that he'd actually had a conversation, or certainly a discussion with Leslie Ann Dodds around the fact that there may have been a relationship, but that was all now resolved.
Further inquiries revealed more details of this unusual love triangle.
These 2 relationships that she was having with these 2 men, judging by text messages that were exchanged, they were both fiery relationships. David Gill had only become aware that his fiancée, Leslie Ann Dodds, had been having an affair with Pat, I think a couple of days before. He also contacted Pat McCormick's wife to let her know about the affair, and she was able to tell them that she also knew. So it would appear that David was one of the last people to know in that small circle that his fiancée was in fact having an affair with Pat McCormick.
None of this necessarily helps you to prove the murder and the killing of Pat McCormick. We didn't have Pat's body still. We didn't know exactly how he died. That was our strongest hypothesis. But at that point, we weren't quite there. And so we got to the point of the day where we actually released Leslie Ann Dodds and David Gill on bail, which wouldn't be unusual, and that's to allow us to conduct those further inquiries, because you can't hold, suspects in custody for endless periods of time.
Police had a motive, jealousy, but they needed hard evidence and decided to track the movements of David Gill and his blue transit van after he had left the flat the night Pat went missing.
There was a lot of really significant developments, both on witness inquiries and in CCTV, which my team of detectives gathered. We became aware of very significant movements of David Gill the day after, in the early hours of the Friday morning. So we knew that he had travelled from his home address back into Cumber Town Centre before 7 a.m. on a Friday morning. David Gill had taken a route through the town. He then parked his transit van as close as he could to the premises here, and then had used the back entrance through the ground level. This wasn't an area that was particularly busy at that time of the morning, so it gave him some cover from members of the public or other witnesses potentially seeing what he was doing. We had witnesses reporting that a fairly heavy-set male was cleaning up around the apartment area, carrying out bags of rubbish to a blue Ford Transit van which was parked right behind the flat. He said that he'd gone in to clear up a bit, which didn't really make sense to police, but that was what he was telling us. After he then drove straight up High Street through the junction here, out towards, there's a little primary school along that road, took a left and then headed out towards Ballygowan.
Heather and the major investigation team needed to discover what David Gill had been cleaning up.
Critical to this was the forensic examination of Leslie Ann Dodd's flat. Police had entered it on the Sunday when he went missing and hadn't overtly seen any signs of, that a murder had occurred or that it was a crime scene. At that point, we go back and go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. We bring our specialists with us. You'd be looking at anything that potentially would be able to prove that something had occurred there that resulted in the injury or the death or the harm to Pat McCormick, and even that put either our suspects or Pat McCormick present at that location at that time. That was slightly more difficult because we knew the flat belonged to Leslie Ann Dodd. We knew she was in a long-term relationship with David Gill. His DNA would be there, his fingerprints would be there. Pat McCormick was also in a relationship. So his DNA and his fingerprints and footwear, they could be easily explained.
While the presence of DNA belonging to either David Gill or Pat McCormick might not have been suspicious, David Gill's behaviour definitely was.
So part of our witness inquiries that we had conducted, somebody had seen David Gill cleaning up in the communal stairway. Police officers had noted a strong smell of bleach. Witness inquiries had also revealed that David Gill had brought down some black bags. So we carried out investigations in relation to the communal stairway as well, and there was brown substance found on the stairs.
The substance was sampled and sent for testing. The search also uncovered a distinctive item: Pat McCormick's tobacco box.
It's like a wee tin box, and it was blue, and it had like a wee design on it, and there were just to keep cigarettes in it because he would have rolled. So I had to identify that box, and I had to write a statement about it because obviously that was his. I knew what his box was because I would have put his cigarettes in for him whenever he would hand me them. I put them back in the box for him and stuff.
Crucially for police, Morgan had reported that she'd seen Pat with the tin the day he went missing after dropping her off at school.
That tin was located within Leslie Ann Dodd's flat. When it was tested, it tested for Pat McCormick's DNA. So we knew that he had been in that flat later on the 30th of May.
But a tobacco tin was no replacement for finding Pat himself. Heather and Jennifer needed to continue the search and called on a specialist team.
I'm Colin Ferguson. During the case, I was the team leader for the search and rescue team and the dive team. We basically access areas that ordinary police can't get into. So that can be at height using ropes or various platforms. We can work in water. Our main role was in the mountains and sort of wilderness areas. So for doing recoveries in those sort of areas whereby it's just more technical and a lot more skill is required. We were called in initially to search some of the roofs of the buildings in the general area.
All of the search activity was centred around finding Pat, and specifically the last clothing that he'd been wearing. We knew that he had an iPhone SE, which had never been recovered, and we knew that he was wearing his glasses and a Ben Sherman watch. So it was his personal items or anything connected to Pat at all that we were searching for.
It's now more than a fortnight since Pat McCormick was last seen in Comber Town Centre. Along with police, up to 23 volunteers examined paths off the Ballydrain Road outside Comber.
Pat's mobile phone had never been found, but investigations revealed it disconnected from the network shortly after he disappeared. Heather hoped if the team could locate it, It could lead them to Pat.
The searches continued, and then information came in that the vehicles were seen driving out a particular road, and the phone that was being used had suffered a catastrophic failure, which would sort of indicate that it had been put into water. We believe that the phone suffered a catastrophic failure out the Ballydrain Road, heading out from Cumber, out towards Castle Lesby. So the first part of tidal water crossed that road. That was where we had the search.
They told us we're out looking for him with sniffer dogs, and there's police doing their searches and everything. And I just remember, the rest of it was a blur.
We were searching for the phone initially over 2 days in the mud. We didn't actually find anything.
It was a blow to the investigation, but results from the forensics lab provided a major step forward. The brown substance recovered from the stairs was Pat McCormick's blood.
There was 7 swabs which contained the blood of Pat McCormick, mostly around the stairwell area, on the walls and some of the door architrave into the apartment. There was also, I think, 3 swabs which were attributable to blood from David Gill.
With the forensic evidence that we uncovered, we were able to place both Pat McCormick and David Gill in the communal stairway of those apartments.
It was a really positive step forward, and it fitted with our hypothesis that we believed Pat had been lured to that location. David Gill had been lying there in wait for 45 minutes and had then murdered him, and during that both had spilled blood to a degree which we had then located and forensically examined at the scene. It doesn't necessarily prove a murder has happened, and ultimately we needed either some kind of direct witness evidence, and the best evidence of course would be if we could find Pat, and then we would have the post-mortem and the examination to determine what had caused his death.
Heather and Jennifer needed to discover where David Gill had gone after cleaning up the flat and leaving Cumber.
He remains at home for the next sort of 3 hours or so, at which point on CCTV we see he returns to Cumber. He drives out to the Macra Scouse Road between Cumber and Ballygowan, and it was unclear what he was doing.
We had viewed a lot of CCTV on the different routes that he would have taken before, and his vehicle wasn't picked up on those routes. And then his vehicle isn't sighted again on CCTV for approximately 3 hours.
What we could see from all of the CCTV, which was being gathered from so many different locations, that throughout the day he changed his outfit 3 times.
It does make you wonder why, if he wore the same clothes all day the previous day, that this was a change in his behaviour, and that there must be a reason for it.
He returned home via a shop in Lisbon, and on that CCTV footage you could actually see that from his knees down, the trousers that he was wearing were visibly wet and muddy. He went into the shop and he bought himself a pizza and he bought a bottle of bleach, which was highly significant to the theory that we were working on in terms of the body deposition.
David Gill's appearance suggested he was in a wet, muddy environment that afternoon. This was valuable information that Heather and Jennifer could use to narrow the search area.
All of the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, and we were getting to see what David Gill did throughout the Friday and how he got rid of the body and how he was trying to then get rid of any evidence or connection to himself.
Despite analysing hours of CCTV from over 80 different sites, the team still couldn't fully account for David Gill's movements. They turned to the public for help.
As part of the investigation, we did 19 media releases in the first 6 weeks.
If you're out in the Cumber area and you come across discarded clothing, please get in contact with detectives at Musgrave Street.
The public appeals paid off.
Information came in that there was 2 large bodies of water in this Ballygowan area, somewhere quite remote.
The caller claimed David Gill had a connection to a property beside one of these bodies of water.
Obviously, areas where there are bodies of water are potentially more preferable for someone to dispose of a body because you have that physical cover, and also it's slightly more difficult to maybe recover or for a member of the public to disturb it or to find anything.
It seemed to provide an ideal place to conceal a body.
It was an area that he was familiar with and probably would have been comfortable to go to do something like to dispose of the body. It also was just set back slightly from the road and had quite good vegetation and cover around it. We decided that lake was so significant that we wanted police divers to search it.
Once we get the call, we get the plan, we'll obviously look at photography and mapping of the areas, see the size of it, and then come up with an estimate of how long that will take. But given the size of it and the fact there was 2 bodies of water, we brought in additional rafting and some other little bits of sonar equipment because some of it on the far side was actually fairly deep. When you're diving in a quarry, you have quite sheer sides on it, so it means that the sunlight only penetrates down maybe a metre or 2, so very quickly you get into complete darkness. Depending on how long the quarry has been flooded, there's years of vegetation that has been decomposing on the bottom, so it could be 2 or 3 feet of silt. So once the diver actually touches bottom, that will all lift up and be suspended in the water. It will stay there because there's nothing to take it away. It's just basically clouds of darkness. So quite often it's easier just to shut your eyes and just go by touch. But when you're searching for a body, you don't know what you're going to be touching next. Finding a body in water can be difficult. It is not an exact science. We can never say exactly what the body will do once it goes subsurface. The body then will slowly start to decompose. The warmer the water, the faster people will start to decompose.
But the team weren't just looking for a body. The media appeals had delivered another significant lead.
A member of the public came forward and said, I heard your appeal and I was just thinking that it may or may not be relevant, but my bin went missing around the time of Pat's murder. It was highly relevant that someone who lived to the rear of the flats was reporting that in and around the time they'd actually purchased a new bin and then it had gone missing. It can be difficult to move a body, and experience and professional judgment will tell you that, suitcases and, wheelie bins, just a normal household black bin, potentially could have been used in that action.
The first search area was a larger quarry with a slightly adjoining smaller quarry. Given the size of it, we thought we would start that large quarry first. We searched the shallow bits and then the sides, then moved out onto the actual bed of the quarry. It started to tail away quite deeply, so it took a good day to clear those initial areas. And the second day then we decided that we would use the raft to go out and check the smaller areas. As we were paddling out, we saw a rope just below the surface. We tried to pull up the rope, but it was too heavy. Got a little bit more difficult because there were some trees that had fallen down into it. But the diver was able to overcome them, and then you could see the wheelie bin that was caught up in the branches. We have permanent communications with the diver. He was describing the wheelie bin as being new. There was no rust or anything on the wheels. It was still bright and shiny. The rope was wrapped around the top of it. That was floating up towards the surface. And he described the wheelie bin as having a ratchet strap right around it, securing the lid into it. We thought, this is so unusual, this has to be connected to the case. And we were able to get a rope to that, and team on the surface then hauled it up onto the bank. We stood it upright, it was quite heavy. At that point then, I took my team off to one side. We want to get a specialist in.
I received a phone call that they'd found a black wheelie bin which contained the body of Pat McCormick. There was almost a sense of relief. We had found him, and that was going to be so valuable in terms of the forensic case and being able to then charge Leslie Ann Dodds and David Gill with murder. But it also meant that the family were going to get him home, and we're going to be able to give him the family burial and to say their goodbyes.
They told us they'd found a body in the bottom of a lake. It was confirmed it was my dad because they had to check dental records, and they checked he had tattoos on his arms and his chest. I didn't want to believe it was my dad at all. I just remember feeling very empty and drained, and I just felt as if a part of me was taken away. I was so close to him, so it felt like a part of me was ripped out of me. I remember just feeling awful.
The post-mortem report had proven that Pat had died from a very severe and prolonged beating. He had suffered 24 fractures to his ribs and a broken nose. The cause of death was as a result of those fractures to his ribs, which would have inhibited his ability to breathe and essentially caused his death. There's quite a significant difference in frame and stature between David Gill and Pat McCormick. Pat was actually known by some close friends as tiny. I think he weighed less than 10 stone and was 5 foot 4 inches tall, compared with David Gill, who was over 6 foot and weighed over 23 stone. So there's quite a significant weight and size difference.
David Gill was massive. He is a huge man. And I had seen the images of Pat, so I was aware at the outset that the difference in stature couldn't be more glaring. There was no match physically between the two of them.
Detectives could now rearrest Dodds and Gill, and this time charge them with murder.
They were both interviewed by my team throughout the day on the 11th of July. We took a phased approach to it. This was really to allow us to introduce all of the evidence that we now held, all of the CCTV and witness inquiries and forensics that had came back, and critically, the fact that we'd found Pat. And to ask him to account. You were there. You were with him for a 45-minute window after which no one's seen him. We had a really strong case at that point. David Gill was prepared to talk to us and continued with his story that it was not him. He had been drunk that night and didn't remember and wasn't involved. You know, it was deniability, and he just was not moving from that point.
Leslie Ann Dodds took a similar approach.
At no point did Leslie Ann show any remorse or any guilt around what she'd done. She was not admitting to any involvement in the murder of Pat McCormick. The case that we were making wasn't that she had been involved in the physical murder or indeed even the removal and disposal of Pat McCormick's body. But she was instrumental behind the planning and the orchestration of what happened on that murderous night. I think it was 10 o'clock in the evening. I charged David Gill with murder, and shortly after midnight, Leslie Ann Dodds was charged with murder. The charge is read out to them. It's quite a formal process, and the reply is noted. I remember David Gill was staring at me while I read it to him, and he said, "Totally innocent, not guilty." And when the charge of murder was put to Leslie Ann Dodds, she simply replied no.
But detectives still had a problem. They had no way to place David Gill at the quarry where Pat's body was found. and neither suspect was given anything away. So Heather turned again to Paul Hope's cell site analysis. He now examined the day after the murder.
Gill's phone starts off at the home address and at about 7 a.m. goes over to the flat at Comber and then travels to and from again on a couple of occasions on that day. He's there on the last occasion from around 12:30 to around 13:30 on the Friday. And then his phone is turned off, or his phone detaches from the network, and it doesn't come on again until 16:20.
It seemed David Gill had likely turned his phone off in a bid to hide his location, but he'd made a fatal error.
This first map is a map of the location of the mast and the direction in which the cell is providing coverage for the specific cell ID that was used by Gill's phone at 16:20 when he turns his phone back on. That clearly is giving coverage in the direction of the quarry.
Heather and Jennifer were confident they had a strong case. They could prove Pat went to Comber to meet Leslie Ann Dodds at her flat. Instead, he found only David Gill. There was a violent struggle. Gill later left the property alone, leaving Pat dead or dying. Throughout, Leslie Ann stayed at David Gill's house from where she was in contact with Pat. Gill returned the next morning and removed Pat's body in a wheelie bin. Phone records later placed him at the quarry where the body was recovered.
These investigations are very complex and extensive. Lots and lots of hours of work go into them. Our job is to try and get justice for Pat McCormick and to support his family through the process.
I was finding it very hard to process. I was going out drinking with my friends every Saturday. I was trying to get distracted and not think about it. I don't think I've still processed it to this day. Just a part of us taken away. And we just didn't really know what to do with it.
The trial process is a very difficult process for any family member who've lost a loved one in these horrific circumstances to sit through. There's post-mortem reports, there's evidence from the likes of police divers, there's CCTV that could be very upsetting. The trial was due to proceed. All of a sudden, David Gill's barrister asked the judge if his client could be rearranged. Nobody expected this. The clerk of the court asked David Gill to stand. He stood, and when the charge of murdering Pat McCormick was put to him again, on this occasion, on this Friday morning, he pleaded guilty. That doesn't happen very often.
The court, it was really weird and it wasn't nice. We got there, the jury was all sworn in, and then all of a sudden he was pleading guilty to murder.
It did not surprise me because I knew the strength of the case. I knew the weight of the forensic evidence, the CCTV particularly, all of the phone data and the witness. It all pointed towards the fact that he had killed Pat McCormick that night and then had gotten rid of him the next day.
The trial of Leslie Ann Dodds resumed 5 months later in Belfast.
She was still maintaining that she was not guilty of murder, and on the day that her trial was due to start, a new charge of manslaughter was added to the books by the prosecution. That's an alternative to the murder charge, so she pleaded guilty to that.
She was aware that David Gill was going to be at the apartment and that Pat McCormick was going there, and she was aware there was going to be some sort of physical altercation. The basis of her plea was that she didn't believe or didn't realise that there was going to be really serious harm. She just was aware that there was going to be substantial harm, and that was the difference.
We were all happy, my brothers and sisters, they were happy that they were pleading guilty because it means it wasn't going to be a 6-week court case, because we didn't really want it to be dragged out, because they always drag the victim's name through the mud, and my dad wasn't there to defend himself for anything.
David Gill got 16 years, a minimum life term of 16 years, which is average for this kind of crime. Leslie Ann Dodds got 5.5 years, which was half in custody and half on licence, which is quite a typical sentence for a charge of manslaughter.
On the 22nd of June 2023 at Belfast Crown Court, 4 years after Pat's murder, his family finally secured the justice they'd been searching for. David Gill and Leslie Ann Dodds were now both behind bars.
I remember when they did get sentenced, I was really happy in the moment with the sentencing, but I wish I thought she was going to get more years. It wouldn't have happened without her. Like, David wouldn't have ever met my dad, would have knew nothing about him if it wasn't for her.
We've been stripped of our father. My dad will never get to see any of us grow up or get married. He'll never get to hold his future grandkids, and we leave here today with only memories of our dad who has been taken from us.
Whenever you see the timeline and you put things together, you can just see it unravelling, and that great sense of Pat almost knew it wasn't right. He had made his mind up, and then he went back, and just resulted in such sad and tragic consequences for him.
Leslie Ann Dodds wasn't involved in the physical act of killing Pat McCormick, but without her involvement, it could not have happened, because it was that phone call that lured him back. And I think that's one of the coldest parts of this case, was that it could have turned out so differently if Pat had gone with his instinct or gone with the advice or the information police had given him and never returned. You know, it could have been a completely different ending for Pat.
I knew who it was straight away. It was Leslie Ann and it was David. But I'm always pointing fingers at her because I knew that she was the one that done it, if you know what I mean. Like, she would have been the one controlling everything. I was just wanting to know why he actually did it. Like, himself, because he didn't know my dad, he didn't know anything about my dad, and she clearly knew nothing about my dad either. It all just felt like he was a pawn in their game. I just miss being able to see him, because I would have seen him every single day. I miss the relationship and the bond, because I would have turned to my dad for anything, and I would have told him anything. I will talk to him. I'll tell him about my day and how he's always in the back of my mind and everything. But I would go and sit by the grave. I don't go as much now, just because it is upsetting. But it is nice going and sitting by the grave, knowing that he's in there. His soul's gone, but he's still in there.